So let's get back to those text form fields. And here I want to do two things. I want to add validation and I want to be able to get hold of the entered values. Now I'll start with validation. And as you learned earlier in the course, in the forms and handling user input section, you can add this validator parameter to text form field widgets. And this then takes a function which will automatically give you the currently entered value, which will be a string or null. And then in there, you can return an error message. So you can return a string if you consider the value to be invalid, and otherwise you can return null if the value should be treated as valid. So therefore here we can use an if statement to check if the value is equal to null maybe, or if the value is empty. So if it's an empty string, you also might want to call trim on the value before calling is empty to make sure that access whitespace is removed. And here, since this is the email address input, I also want to add at least a basic check that ensures that a valid email address was entered. Now you could get more sophisticated here, but here I'll just check if not, the value contains an @ symbol, so the @ character. If the enter text does not contain such a @ symbol, I consider it to be invalid. So if either of these conditions here is met, and one of them is enough because of this OR operator that connects the conditions, I'll return an error message. Please enter a valid email address, like this. If we don't make it into this if check here, we know that the value is valid, and therefore then we should return null. So that's my validation logic for the email address input field. Next up, let's work on the password field. And here I'll also add this validator parameter and add this function that gets a value. And here I will copy this if statement from the email address input. And I still want to check whether a value is null, but in addition, I'll also trim the value and then check its length. And I want to make sure that the length is at least 6 characters long. So if it's less than 6 characters long, I want to make it into this if statement and return an error message. Because the password should have a certain minimum length, which in my case here will be 6, also because that's the minimum length that will be enforced by Firebase later. So here I'll then say password must be at least 6 characters long. And if we don't make it into this if check and the value is valid, I'll return null here. So that's the validation. Of course, as mentioned, the goal also is to get hold of these entered values, and for that I'll add a brand new method to this off-screen state class here. I'll name it _submit, and it will not return anything. And this should be triggered whenever this elevated button is pressed. So I'll set submit here, _submit, as a value for on pressed on that elevated button. Now in the end here in this submit method, I then want to trigger my validators and make sure that all the inputs are saved and I get hold of the entered values. And you learned that for that, you can essentially create a form key, which in the end is a global key, which will be connected to the form state. And you learned about this global key, this form key here, in the forms section earlier in the course. This global form key here can and should then be assigned as a value to the key parameter on the form widget. And it's then through that form key that we get access to the form. So here in submit, we can use our form key here to get hold of the current state, which in the end will be our form state, and call validate, for example. And actually, I'll just name it _form, since this name makes a bit more sense to me than form key. But of course, the name in the end does not matter. But with that, we got this form property that holds the global key and is connected to the form, and we can then call validate on that. Now I'll need to add an exclamation mark here though to tell Dart that this will be set. It will not be null, because we know that submit can only be triggered via this elevated button, and if that elevated button is available, the form will be available as well, so it will not be null. And of course, validate, as you learned earlier, then returns a Boolean, which in the end tells us whether the entered values are valid or not. Hence, I'll store that result of running my validators in a isValid variable, a final variable, which we can then use thereafter in that submit method. Because I can then check if isValid. Alternatively, we could of course also just grabbed that code and used that as a condition here, but here I'll do it in 2 steps to keep the code slightly more structured and organized. And if my inputs are valid, I again want to reach out to my form current state, and I want to call save. And you might recall that save then triggers a special function that can be assigned to all those text form fields. The onSaved function. So a function you assign to the onSaved parameter. Now this function then gets the currently entered value automatically, and you can then do with that value whatever you want. For example, store it in a property of this class, and that's what I'll do here. I'll add a new variable, entered email, which initially is an empty string, and another new variable, entered password, which also initially is an empty string. And I then want to set entered email in the onSaved function of the email input. So I'll set entered email equal to value. And of course, value theoretically could be null here, though we of course know that here it won't be because I'm checking for value being equal to null here in my validator. And since I only call save if all my validators passed, I know that at this point the entered value won't be null. Hence here we can add an exclamation mark and then store our entered email. We don't need to use setState here because here I actually don't want to update the UI. Hence I'll just store it like this and then in the end repeat this step here on the password input here. So there I then want to update my entered password. And of course you learned about all that before. This is just some repetition in the end. And therefore here, after calling save, we should be able to print the entered email and of course also the entered password. And later we'll send that to Firebase instead of printing it. But for the moment, if I save this, reload everything, open my debug console, and I then go back here and I enter some email address and also a password, and I click login. Nothing happens here because we haven't added any logic to let anything happen. But if we go back here, we can see those input values here. So collecting them works and validating them also works because if I, for example, remove the @ symbol here, you see I get this error message. If my password is too short, I get an error message there as well. So that all works as expected. With that, we're collecting the inputs, and now we can send them to Firebase.